Did the Brazilian government just get busted providing Russian intelligence with cover documents and stories, allowing their agents to go all over the globe, including the highest levels of European government? Plus, we're going to talk about the other cover story, arguably the worst cover-up of all time, Trump's unbelievably bad efforts to hide the Epstein story. Are things looking even worse for him? Plus, we're going to talk about Ukraine's anti-corruption corruption, just what is going on and why are Ukrainians up in arms about it? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about all of these crazy stories. Okay, so the top story, because this is pretty insane, is the reporting from actually PBS and a New York Times investigation found that Brazil was actually laundering effectively the identities of Russian intelligence agents. And this is absolutely insane. So the story profiles a couple of these individuals. One was a Brazilian man named Gerhard Daniel Campos Wittich, right? And this is someone who was, by all accounts, an accomplished Brazilian. He had built a robust 3D printing business in Rio de Janeiro. He had a Brazilian girlfriend. He had a nice apartment in a nice part of Rio. Him and his girlfriend had a cat together. He had friends. His friends said he was pretty shy, reserved, and didn't like having his photo taken, right? But Daniel, Gerhard Daniel, wasn't even Gerhard Daniel at all. His real name was Artem Shimrev. And he was married, had a Russian wife who was also an intelligence officer living under a fake identity in Greece. And this is just absolutely insane because Artem literally was texting his Russian wife while living with his girlfriend and saying how much he hates his work. He thought he would be doing more. There's nothing. He's not getting any results. And his wife was like, look, get over it, buddy, which is absolutely insane. And this is just one example of the dozens, possibly hundreds of Russian spies who went to Brazil and obtained Brazilian identity documents, right? This isn't a case of a sort of thinly veiled false identity. Again, this is somebody who clearly spent years building a real trail of real, again, a real Brazilian girlfriend, a real 3D printing business, a real apartment in Rio, a real identity. This is completely insane. In fact, the one that blew this off the lid was even crazier. This is someone whose passport said his name was Victor Muller Ferreira. And for those of you that don't know, Brazil is a country with a ton of immigrant communities that came to Brazil in usually the 1900s to the 1950s. So it's not at all uncommon to see, a lot of Brazilians have Portuguese names, but you also see a ton. Brazil, for example, has one of the largest populations of Japanese immigrants outside of Japan. So you see a ton of Japanese names. In some areas, you see a ton of German names. You'll see a ton of course, Spanish and Portuguese names. But you also, so it's not unusual at all to see Brazilians with a name like Victor Muller, right? But Victor Muller's real name was Sergei Chereskov, and he was an officer with Russia's GUR. And he was arrested following a tip from the CIA to the Brazilian Federal Police. But what's insane is that he had an airtight cover story. He had a real passport, a real driver's license, and even a certificate stating that he had completed his mandatory military service in Brazil. He had a voter registration card and a birth certificate. The only problem is when the police actually found the family members of the woman he said was his mother, the woman was like, hey, she never had a child. And that was the break that sent the Brazilian police pouring over millions of identity documents looking for someone who'd come to Brazil late in life as an adult, claimed a birth certificate, and set out collecting all these other documents. In fact, over 3 years, they found 9 names, all outed by Brazilian authorities, and what they say is a huge blow to Putin's spy program. Now, here's what's crazy, too, is that a lot of these guys weren't like our boy Gerhard Daniel, right? Gerhard Daniel was clearly in the process of building an identity, but the Brazilian government has actually significant programs to sponsor the education, training, and even employment of its most educated citizens abroad. It's actually pretty easy, and the Brazilian government works pretty hard to sort of project power through its educated populace. And the Russians took advantage of this. And so you saw a lot of these, quote, Brazilians, unquote, end up sent out in the world and engaging in espionage. Some went to Europe, in Portugal, right? Again, a really common pattern to see Brazilians migrate to Portugal, trying to get EU residency. They also have one who got an internship at The Hague, the International Criminal Court, right? Which was literally investigating Putin's war crimes. Another was sent to the Middle East, right? The point of this program is to launder the identities, so anyone looking into their backgrounds will just find some Brazilians. And the crazy part is that the Brazilian government, or at least individuals in the Brazilian government, it's highly likely have a favorable view of Russia. And this stems back, let's see if we can find it, to the Cold War, where there was actually a pretty significant overlap between Russia and Brazil. In fact, the current Brazilian Workers' Party, PT, well, right now it has the red and white flag, but that's kind of a new addition. In fact, it considers itself a socialist and at times even communist party. Let's see if we can find an old school PT flag. Let's see, Brazil PT flag, old. And once you see it, you'll say, huh, this really tracks. PT flag, hammer and sickle, right? There we go. Here is the flag of the old school, many of the old school communist parties in Brazil, right? So, again, communist parties and the Workers' Party, right? Literally, Marxist-Leninist flag right there. And so I think the Brazilians also just generally seem to have a less combative view of Russia. In fact, in one survey asking residents of different countries to name what they view as the greatest threat to world peace, Brazil said 29% of Brazilians said the U.S. is the greatest threat to world peace, 15% said China, and only 12% said Russia was a threat to world peace, with literally 20% either refusing or didn't know which country was bad. And this is actually unusually low. Of the countries that identify Russia as a threat to world peace, only Canada is a lower number of Russians. So this is, I think, a sign that the Brazil was a ripe and kind of fertile ground to do this. They also likely found clearly somebody in the Brazilian government was like facilitating this in some way. Now, it could have been as little as one sort of pro-Russian, one Russian dual citizen who was working at, say, a Brazilian like records office, who said, listen, I can find women who maybe were issued a birth certificate to a stillborn, or women who died, before reaching childbearing age, but after legal adulthood, where a birth certificate would just make a lot of sense. And there's not going to be a person who's going to raise their hand and say, hey, this person, I'm this person's mother and I never gave birth to this guy. And so I think this is but I think there's other countries that are almost certainly engaging in this. And you have to think that Russian intelligence, right, has been placing its agents in other countries for years. It would make perfect sense to either find actual dual citizens. This is, I think, what a lot of countries do, is they find actual dual citizens who are actually have sort of the cultural background to operate in both places. And likely, again, this guy, these Russians almost certainly had some sort of cover story that said, well, my dad was Russian, my mom was Brazilian. And when I was born, my dad moved to Russia for work. So, now I'm back. Right. I think that's some version of that story, but you could also find real people who have that actual story and use them as intelligence agents. But before, what I wanted to talk about, though, it has been another story. Speaking of sort of, we talk about this corruption. Let's talk a little bit about anti-corruption, particularly in Ukraine, right? Now, there have been mass protests in Ukraine actually, around a change to the law, namely the Ukrainian anti-corruption institutions, right, have been working pretty hard. There are two key anti-corruption bodies, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. And what makes anti-corruption offices effective is their independence. In the United States, we have what are called our inspectors general, and they are our anti-corruption office. They do financial audits to make sure government money is being spent in accordance with the law. They do criminal investigations to see if an individual has committed a crime or is abusing their power or abusing their access in a level that's criminal. And they also do what the office I was a part of, special reviews and evaluations, where they ask larger questions of like, is this program delivering results that it's supposed to, or is it being used for a different policy purpose? Sort of like a non-monetary audit, like the money's being spent in a non-fraudulent way, but people are doing fraudulent things. And so these kind of offices are fully independent. To give you an idea in the United States, how independent we are, despite me working for the Department of Homeland Security's Inspector General, I was paid by the Department of Agriculture, because what if I had to audit the department's pay system? How could I audit the pay system that sends me my checks? And this is totally true, right? Our offices are located in a different part of DC. We don't share office space with the department. Our chain of command is completely separate. There were basically no department employees within the chain of command. There was as minimal leverage as possible between the anti-corruption agency, the Inspector General's office, and the office we oversaw, Homeland Security. That is key to an effective anti-corruption program. And it's one of the problems, actually, one of the reasons that I left was exactly this, because the independence was being compromised, because the appointees were increasingly, the people in charge of the agency weren't anti-corruption specialists. They weren't people who would come up from the agency, but instead, and this was the first Trump administration, just to be totally candid, these were people who had no experience in anti-corruption, but were long-time, multi-year Republican Party partisans, right? One had been an advisor to the Arizona governor, for example, for many, many years, and then had simply been placed at the top of the agency, despite having never run an agency and serving only at the lowest possible level years prior as an investigator in a small sub-office. So this kind of politicization of anti-corruption agencies is unbelievably bad. So the Ukrainians, President Zelensky and the Ukrainian parliament actually passed a law that said, listen, we are going to put these two anti-corruption bodies under the thumb of the parliament. We are going to make sure that political appointees get a say over how they operate. And again, when my agency got this political appointee, he made sure to amplify reports that were that made the administration's priorities look valid and good, right? For example, when it was found that Border Patrol was hampered from doing their job. Those reports, which were done factually and honestly, but they were amplified. They were rushed through the process. The language was made even stronger. But when you found things that didn't align with the administration's priorities, the reviews would mysteriously get canned. They would come back again and again for reviews. For example, I once had minor wording changes occur for 4 different times, each one of those iterations taking 2 to 3 months. And this was a finalized report, passed through legal, passed through everybody, went up to the front office, which normally the front office will do a general read over to make sure that it sort of matches tone and everything else. But instead, for the first time, we were getting dozens and dozens of tiny corrections. This sentence is too long. This wording is funny. Revise it. And we would change it. We'd send it back. And suddenly, even sentences that he himself had changed, he was changing back and saying, well, we just need some more work. And each time, right, that functioned as killing the entire report. Delaying it to the point where it was no longer relevant. And that is what is likely trying to happen to these anti-corruption bodies. The difference is that in the United States, nobody really gave a shit. But the Ukrainians, dude, they give a shit. In fact, they are out on the street protesting this, saying veto the law. One person said, if you don't veto it, it's like spitting in the face of every mother, wife, and child who lost a loved one at the front. It's trampling the memory of all those who died for our freedom, dignity, and independence, right? They said, listen, we are essentially returning to January 2014 when our country faced the threat of dictatorship. Because you have to remember that these anti-corruption offices, a lot of these guys are investigating commanders who, for example, steal resources that should be going to units. They investigate contracts, corrupt contracts, for example, that say, here's a contract to build defensive walls or dig trenches in the rear of the front. And then when a businessman or a pockets the money and doesn't dig anything, Ukrainian soldiers die, right? Corruption ends with soldiers dying. And that's why these the Ukrainian women primarily are out here protesting. They're saying, listen, this isn't right. This isn't okay. And veto, I think, is veto. But again, this is, I think, a sign of just how important the Ukrainians view their independence. And what I think is also the real story here is not is that this is an example of the difference between the Ukrainians and Russians, right? And let's see if I can find here. Zelensky had to come out and say, listen, we're sorry. We hear you. We can't get away with this, right? And he said, listen, we're going to give you guys a new plan, a joint action plan to strengthen the justice system. It sounds like they at least are realizing that they can't simply nuke the independence of these two organizations. And, this is an opportunity, of course, to do nothing or to make performative changes. But it's also possible that they are hearing them out and saying, listen, these agencies have to be able to fight high-level corruption, right? And this is not what Vladimir Putin has to deal with. If Vladimir Putin wants a policy made, he makes that policy. And look, there's no protest against the Russian special military operation. There's minimal protests against, say, even things that the Russian government wants to see happen. For example, the repatriation of bodies, the prompt payment of death benefits to Russian families. Right? These are things that Putin does not allow meaningful protests, and he definitely never reverses course. The only sort of counterexample that we can even have is the mobilization policy. But even then, it wasn't so much that there was popular revolt about Russia's mobilization in 2022, but it was more about the fact that Russia was experiencing a massive, massive brain drain. And Putin realized that it was just bad policy. But there is a clear fundamental difference between a civil society that says, hey, listen, we value the independence of our institutions, and a civil society that is simply under the thumb of an autocrat, right? Again, a lot of Russian propaganda, a lot of like AI-generated Russian tweets say that, oh, well, the Ukraine and Russia, they're just both dictatorships. Why are you so worried about all these corrupt dictatorships fighting each other? But no, it's just not true, right? Ukraine remains a functioning democracy. Its constitution says, hey, listen, if your country's fighting a war, like, you don't have to hold fresh elections. You can delay them by a couple of years. But that still doesn't mean that the power is not concentrated in the president's office in Kiev. There is still a parliament. There are still independent anti-corruption bodies. And there are still the Ukrainians themselves who have an independent say in how their government functions. So again, when somebody rolls out that Russian talking point, you can just point them to this story. And before we talk about, speaking of corruption, anti-corruption, we're going to talk about Trump and his the Epstein cover-up is just getting even worse. But before we talk about that, I want to mention, of course, guys, that if you want to lock in, if you want to be part of the 1% of guys that doesn't let, oh, I'm busy, oh, I'm tired, oh, I can't do it, stop them. You guys that follow me on Instagram know that just a couple weeks ago, when my son was literally like 3 weeks old, I ran a triathlon. My sleep score going into that was 46. My watch said I slept 3 hours. It was not my greatest performance, but that's okay. What it was I got the job done in 92-degree heat. And the reason is because I have a good plan, I have focus, I'm trained, and I was very caffeinated. That is what Strike Gum is for. Strike Gum is for the 1% of guys that don't let busy stop them. Go to strikegum.com, get the sugar-free energy drink alternative. Each piece of Strike Gum, the caffeine equivalent of a Red Bull or an Amp Energy. The link is in the description, guys. There's a reason 80% of our customers come back. So it's the real deal. Now, let's talk about the president's just absolutely getting sandblasted by this scandal. This is pretty bad. Okay, so one, there's a whole bunch of preposterous news, but let's take a look at this. Trump is absolutely raging because CNN has found two new videos of Trump's second wedding to Marla Marples at the Plaza Hotel in New York. And guess who was one of Trump's wedding guests? Why, old Jeffy Epstein, someone who Trump says he was never friends with and never liked and never hung out with. All right. And 2 months earlier, of course, the pair are also shown during the opening of a Harley-Davidson cafe in New York. The CNN also, of course, aired footage of the 1999 Victoria's Secret runway show in New York, showing Trump with Melania chatting with Epstein, right? And again, they say both the photos and videos are from before any of Epstein's known legal issues, i.e. before he was charged with trafficking. But as you guys know, he faced trafficking charges in 2006? But the investigation found he'd been at least trafficking those girls in Miami for long before then. And in statements from victims in civil suits, Epstein's trafficking of young women and girls occurred well into the 90s. So at this time, according to at least civil suits filed by other people, I have to be careful what I say so I don't get sued by the administration. At least there is credible evidence from statements from the victims in civil suits that Epstein was engaging in this level of trafficking in the 90s. The same time, Trump was being friends with old Jeffy Epstein. And of course, when asked about it during a phone call, Trump said, "You've got to be kidding me," called them fake news, and hung up. That's exactly the behavior you would expect from an innocent man who simply has nothing to hide, right? Again, you notice that even the other people who are strongly associated with Epstein don't respond with that level of cringe. They simply say, yeah, man, Epstein, wow, I was as shocked as you guys were that he trafficked all those young girls, right? But don't worry, guys. Congress, our highly independent Congress, is on the case because in an unusual act of bipartisanship, right, California Democrat Ro Khanna and Kentucky Representative Republican Thomas Massie have issued a joint resolution that's also backed by Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Nancy Mace, Tim Burchett, and Thomas Massie have signed on to a resolution that says, listen, we want to make it legally binding that the president unveil the entirety of the Epstein files, right? And this is wild. Because what is worth pointing out is that when Epstein was arrested in 2019, during Trump's first term, he was sitting in jail and he had been charged with trafficking. In fact, he had been charged with abuse of minors, and his associate, Ghislaine Maxwell, had been tried and convicted of trafficking women and girls. And so he was sitting in jail, but there was a sprawling investigation that obviously found that he had done all of these things. There was presumably videos. There was statements from the women. There was statements from friends. Like clearly he had systematically abused these girls over a long period of time. And people have said, well, okay, you have to release that evidence, because remember, it would have gone out anyway, because in the U.S., other than some special circumstances, generally evidence is presented in open court, which means available to the public, right? This is, of course, to avoid the dictatorships that do secret courts that say, I can't show you the evidence, but I promise you, this guy we arrested, he's definitely guilty. We just can't show you the evidence, right? So to avoid that, evidence is generally put in open court. So Congress has said, listen, release the files, the evidence that you were going to show against not just Jeffrey Epstein, but also his associates. Because again, Epstein, as we point out, had many high-ranking friends on both parties, right? Famously, people like Bill Gates, who, by the way, has not been charged, but his wife has said that I divorced Bill Gates because of his close friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. Okay? Ask yourself, what would compel you to divorce the richest man in the world in your 60s because of a friendship from 15 to 20 years ago? What exactly was the nature of that friendship that would compel her to do that? And so these kind of high-level, again, people from both parties are likely in the files. And people deserve to know. They just want to know, listen, what's the evidence that more public figures were involved in this, particularly the president? So Thomas Massie, Ro Khanna, they roll out this legislation. It says, show us. Let the public see. Let the public decide for themselves who and what is the nature of the relationship between America's ruling class. I'm just going to call it that. Between America's ruling class and this billionaire guy, Jeffrey Epstein, because there's been a lot of links that we've seen already. But what's insane is that this would pass, right? And this is something that Ro Khanna pointed out, because the House is very narrowly split, right? And 11 Republicans have said, we will defect. We will vote to release these Epstein files too. And of course, every Democrat has said, yeah, we are absolutely going to vote for this. Which I want to point out that there is a lot of evidence that former Democratic President Bill Clinton is strongly associated with Jeffrey Epstein. There's many links. He appears on the flight logs. He visited the island. There is some allegations that he received some type of service or interactions with girls who were trafficked by Epstein. You also, of course, have people like Larry Summers who flew on the Epstein private jet. So, these are Democrats who are saying we are willing to throw some of our own political rulers, so to speak, under the bus to get at this. So this is something, again, I point out that Joe Biden could have done, but didn't. So the fact that they're willing to do this is at least evidence that the Democratic Party has at least some integrity left. But don't worry, guys, because the speaker is literally just closing up shop early to avoid having to vote on this. House Speaker Mike Johnson is sending members home early for a month-long break from Washington after the week's legislative agenda was nuked by these members who are trying to force a vote on this issue. And why? Well, he says, why do we have to pass a law when the White House is going to release it voluntarily? But here's the thing. This is obviously a farce, because if the White House is going to release it voluntarily, then it wouldn't matter. You should just pass the law and move on with legislating. But the problem is that, well, the White House said they're not actually releasing it voluntarily. See, they said, well, we're going to release the grand jury testimony. But the grand jury testimony is only narrowly focused on Jeffrey Epstein, on the perpetrator, not his larger network, the thing that people want to know about. And what's also just kind of absurd, as I want to point out, is that you can count on the president's absolute sycophants, absolutely just being the worms that they are. One notable senator is Ted Cruz on Newsmax. He says, listen, I want to see the release of all files pertaining to Jeffrey Epstein. I have long called for the release of materials concerning Jeffrey Epstein. Right? He said, Jeffrey Epstein, the man was a pedophile. He preyed on young girls and obviously did not do so alone. And I believe that any man who sexually assaulted an underage girl should be prosecuted and face the full consequences of their actions. Well, here's the thing. What does he call for? I called for the materials concerning Jeffrey Epstein to be made public. Well, he's dead. Nobody cares about Jeffrey Epstein's materials. What they care about is his associates. We can't get any justice from Jeffrey Epstein. He's buried somewhere, hopefully. But the people, look, what people care about is not the Jeffrey Epstein files. It's information about the senior, high-profile people that have associated with him. And the American public has a right to know, listen, who associated with this guy? How close were they? How often did they go to his island or to his house? Did they ever spend the night there? Right? The American public at some point has a right to know, especially their president. Like, yo, dude, you run the country. Are you protecting the people that those girls allege abused them? Like, do we live in a country where you can commit some of those heinous crimes and face no consequences? And so this is classic Ted Cruz. He says, yeah. Release all of Jeffrey Epstein's materials, but redact all those other names. That's implied. Then he says things that we all know are true, that are obviously true. The man was a pedophile. No duh. He preyed on young girls and obviously did not do so alone, which is true. Ghislaine Maxwell already charged as a co-conspirator. And then he says something that we all also agree is true. Any man that sexually assaulted an underage girl should be prosecuted and face the full consequences for their actions. But that is all of those things. What he's not saying is like, that is not releasing the Epstein files. That is saying a bunch of other statements that are sort of kind of related and that he hopes that the American public thinks is the same thing as calling for the full and unredacted release of Jeffrey Epstein, of all the evidence related to Epstein's trafficking operation. Again, really just classic Ted Cruz bullshit. And it drives me crazy. It drives me crazy that he does these things. But what's also interesting is that one of the things that happens in this environment is that it creates room for all kinds of allegations that are true or untrue. For example, a Democratic Senator, Ron Wyden, said that actually his office found that 4 big banks from the Treasury Department flagged almost $1.5 billion in suspicious money transfers involving Epstein. He said much of this appears to be related to his sex trafficking network. So again, clearly there is some sort of client list because somebody was sending or receiving billions of dollars from him that was so weird, the Treasury Department found it suspicious. And what's also worth pointing out is that big banks like JP Morgan, they actually lost in civil court and had to pay out money to victims' families and the victims because they facilitated this sex trafficking operation. So again, this is something that, let's say we can find it in court. Let's see if we can find it on Wikipedia. Right. Here we go. This is 2 years ago. JP Morgan Chase to pay a $290 million settlement with Epstein's victims because the bank ignored warnings about him. So again, wouldn't it be cool to know like who sent money in and out? Is this true? Is it not? Right? Wyden, of course, is a high-ranking Democrat on the Finance Committee. And if what Trump says is true, which he says, I never did anything, I wasn't involved in this, then it should be a trivially easy matter to simply release these transfer files to show, hey, here's all of Jeffrey Epstein's transactions. And as you can see, I, Donald Trump, do not appear in them. So this is what happens. And it would be easy to refute, comically easy. The president wasn't involved, right? I could tell you, you should release the files because you know whose name you won't find in Jeffrey Epstein's financial reports? Mine. I was like, I don't know, whatever, fucking 12 years old in 99. The point is that if you're not worried about it, yeah, let them out. Yeah, good. Let the American public see who their leaders are. See who's in charge. They go, well, what if there's Democrats in there? There's Democrats in there. And they committed a crime. The evidence is sufficient. Charge them. And if they associated with Epstein, but maybe there's not like a smoking gun, maybe not enough evidence to get them. Well, those people should get fired, right? Let's bring back a little cancel culture. Maybe we could use to put cancel culture to good use. Cancel some of these Epstein affiliates, which we could do now, as I pointed out in other videos. There's nothing stopping us. You could write a message to Harvard and be like, yo, Larry Summers flew on Epstein's plane after he was convicted of trafficking those girls. Fire that dude. He's still teaching. He's still teaching classes. But it is what it is. Anyway, guys, hope you appreciate it. Thanks to Peter Fucci, Dan M., Petch Henry Roosier, I just got to call Chris Rossi, AL90, Sergey Zachenko, D. Stewart, James Porsche, B. Emmerling, all of our Lieutenant tier members. You guys are the ones who make it possible for me to do this every single day through your support. Obviously, you can imagine covering issues like this. I am not exactly having sponsors beat down my door. Thanks, guys. See you in the next one. Cheers.